My students and I are cooperating and presenting some ideas on the Catholic imagination, and specifically the Catholic imagination with reference to a book, 1927, by Willa Sibert Cather. Willa Cather, most famous probably for My Antonia, other titles, Song of the Lark, Alexander's Bridge, um, and of course, Death Comes for the Archbishop, which is the title we're discussing here. Now, we're discussing Death Comes for the Archbishop with reference to the Catholic imagination because we agree that the hero of the book, Jean-Marie Latour, the Archbishop, is a perfect illustration of the theme of the Catholic imagination. And we'll get into that later. Now, first, for just a few minutes, I'm going to illustrate what is traditionally meant by the word imagination. It is not the modern concept of imagination. By the modern concept of imagination, we are usually thinking of something that really should be called fantasy. So when we talk about imagination, usually we're thinking of the process of constructing in our minds, totally in our minds, some sort of reality which exists completely independently from the material physical world. But that's fantasy. That's not imagination. Now, the imagination is not the ability to create independently in the mind something completely new. The imagination is the power to the ability to see further and further into the nature of reality. Now, with a Catholic imagination, what we're talking about is the ability to see what we call sacramental reality, or in other words, it is the ability to see the presence of the divine within the ordinary circumstances of the world. So Catholic imagination it's sacramental, and it's also incarnational in that as sacramental people, we believe that there is no longer any kind of wall of separation, any kind of chasm between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Now, what Jean-Marie Latour, the Archbishop of Death Comes to the Archbishop, says about this when he's discussing the nature of miracles, he considers the possibility that miracles are, sudden intrusions of the divine into the ordinary, but he says, no, no, no. He's kind of thinking to himself. He says, what I would prefer to think is that what we call miracles are not sudden intrusions of the divine, but they are the ability to see what is there around us always. The ability to see what is there around us always. That's Catholic imagination. Now, if you are confused about these terms, seeing and vision and such, and you're thinking, where's the big issue here? I open my eyes and the light rays do their thing, and I see. It ain't that easy. I'm going to use as an illustration a painting which I've done often before, but it's a painting which serves the point and serves the point rather quickly. The painting is the Song of the Lark by a French painter, Jules Breton. And in the Song of the Lark, we can talk about the various kinds of seeing. So as the picture comes up and as you see it, you see a French peasant girl standing in the middle of the field. There are some haycocks in the background. She's got bare legs and bare feet and strong hands, and we're done. No, we're not done. Now keep going in this process of seeing. See also that there is an upper half of the canvas and a lower half of the canvas. Where is this upper and lower half? They separate at a horizontal line which comes across the waistline and elbow line of the French peasant girl. All right, so in the upper half then you have golds and yellows, and you have various forms of life in the background. In the lower half you have browns, dominant browns, and a bare field. Now, look again at the upper half. At the upper half, there is a dominant image, which is the rising sun. And if you follow a straight line down into the lower half, that straight line that you are following down connects you with a sickle, which is the same shape as the sun. So in the upper half, a rising sun. In the lower half, the sickle. The upper half, in the rising sun, an image of life. The sickle, and the lower half, an image of death. So you start to put it all together. You put together what you see in the colors, the yellows, the golds in the upper, the browns in the lower, and then what you see in the images, the rising sun, the sickle, and you get the sense that, well, okay, in the upper and lower halves we have essentially a contrast between beginning and ending. We have a contrast between birth and death. We have a contrast between any of the polar opposites of the perpetual cycle that we live, beginning and ending, life and death, spring, winter. It's there. And this French peasant woman is caught in the center of all of this. So the French peasant woman is caught in the cycle of time, the revolution of time, life and death, life and death. She is caught in time as she is caught in the process of labor. She is on the path of labor. She is literally on the path, but metaphorically she is on the path. But here is the genius of the painting, in that while she is in this cycle of labor, the beginning and ending, the life and death, while she is in that cycle, she also pauses. And the title tells us why she is pausing. She hears a lark. She hears beauty. And beauty and the response to beauty, which is what we call awe or wonder, the response of beauty draws us out of the cycle. It calls us to respond to something of the infinite, something of the timeless, something of the changeless, which is what beauty is. So there you have the contrast of the painting. That part of the human person, that part of the French peasant woman, which is caught in the daily cycle, but that part of her which responds to something timeless, eternal, that's all of us. All of us which are part of this cycle, but all of us which are at the same time, sometimes with greater success than others, we're seeing something outside of the cycle. We're responding to something timeless, eternal. So there you have an illustration of what we mean by seeing. At first we saw just the literal surface of the canvas, and then we looked farther and farther and farther and farther. And that is when we got into that farther and farther and farther, that's when we were processing our imagination. That's when we were using our imagination. So again, what is this imagination stuff? It's when you see beyond just the literal and physical in front of you. It's when you begin to make connections and see the implications, the ramifications, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So why are we bothering with this topic, the topic of vision? Well, it's because you, like it or not, you live your life according to what you see. If you do not see a doorway in your room, you will never leave your room. If you do not see the reality of Toledo, Ohio, you will never go there. Every time period in history has been characterized by either a completeness of vision, seeing time and eternity as part of each other, or in most cases, a very limited vision. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the Aztecs, the Vikings all had very limited vision. They saw no reality outside of the reality of time. And if you're thinking, well, these people all had their gods, so they must have seen some reality of time, if you think a little further, you'll realize that those gods are nothing more than forces of nature. In other words, forces of time. How did they live? Look at the history books, and it will tell you how they lived, to what they dedicated themselves, and that most of what they achieved is now, well, it's part of the process of time. In other words, most of what they achieved is now dust. There is an alternative. There is the Catholic vision, the sacramental vision. And as illustration of that vision, then we're returning to the life of Jean-Marie Latour.
The work begins with a conversation between 3 cardinals and a missionary priest, Father Ferrand, whose primary aim is to convince the others of his candidate for the new Diocese of New Mexico. Before Jean-Marie Latour is even named by Ferrand, we learn that his candidate is a French priest, and that the French are the best missionaries. While the Germans classify, the French arrange, he dogmatically concludes. Already there are particular qualities that the cardinals and Ferrand agree must be present in this new bishop. He must be able to see the spiritual needs in a particular area, but also be able to carry out the vision, which requires a level of cooperation from the natives. After Jean-Marie Latour is proposed for the position, immediately thereafter begins a discussion of his intelligence in matters of art, of all things. The Spanish cardinal, Garcia Maria de Allende, cuts in to relate a story about how a missionary begged his grandfather for a painting to bring back with him to New Spain for the church. The cardinal posits that his grandfather's collection was likely the finest in all of Spain, and that, when given the choice, the poor missionary took the best painting, an El Greco depicting a young St. Francis, much to his grandfather's chagrin. With Ferrand's assurance of Latour's intelligence, Allende shares the story and hopes that this candidate might have enough of a discerning eye to recognize this painting and return it to Spain. Even before Latour enters the scene, we are made aware by this discussion of the El Greco that the 4 men are looking for a seer, someone whose vision is refined and has a sense of art. That is, he can see the physical reality in front of him, holding both the details and the whole as significant, while also recognizing the mystery and higher reality implicit in the form, though not apparent to the senses. Our first portrait of Latour is in his journey from Santa Fe to Old Mexico. The detailed depiction of the landscape, the conical red hills spotted with juniper bushes, and the hills that thrust themselves out of the ground and push the others aside, can only be recognized by someone whose vision is attuned to seeing some importance in them, in looking up and out, and who is accustomed to noticing them in the first place. When it is revealed that the repeating hills, combined with the heat of the desert, confuse the traveler, who is sensitive to the shape of things, it should strike us that perhaps the imagery which takes up the first pages of Book 1 is actually through the eyes of the seer, namely Latour. Someone who is sensitive to the shape of things will refine the image of the red hills to being like haycocks, and then leave that descriptor for a more accurate account of the shape, that of the Mexican oven. Exhausted and weary of travel, Latour is consoled by his encounter with a particular juniper tree, which stood out from all the rest of the conical-shaped ones by its towering cruciform shape. He stops and prays before the tree for a while, and when he starts his journey again, he is refreshed. What does he see? Certainly, he sees an odd-looking juniper tree, different from all the rest. This juniper tree, shaped like a cross, in Latour's vision, becomes the cross. The traveler dismounted, drew from his pocket a much-worn book, and baring his head, knelt at the foot of the cruciform tree. For Latour, this cross in the desert points to a reality higher than what is physically present, to which he must respond in devotion, in contemplation of the divine. This vision of the divine in the ordinary is affirmed in another instance when Latour reflects on the pueblo of Acoma. He is somewhat curious as to how the settlers of the mesa first thought of living there, since it was so removed from the soil and water to be able to sustain life. Jacinto, his guide, explains that it was their refuge from the different hostile tribes that surrounded them. The bishop immediately contemplates how even the Acoma share in the universal human yearning for something permanent, enduring, without shadow of change, and that for them, this permanent thing was the rock on which they were able to live. How interesting it is to Latour that for them, what was perhaps the most transcendent reality was something of such form, such substance, and so literal. He relates the imagery of this particular rock to the rock of the New Testament, Peter, who was given the keys to Christ's church, and upon which the church was to be built, and to an Old Testament view of God as Israel's rock. It is evident then that Latour fully realizes here what he is seeing. He sees the rock, which he notes as stark and grim. Perhaps it is even the archetypal form of that which is base, crude, but yet he attributes to the rock the utmost expression of human need. Once again, in an even more striking way, the bishop's vision dwells on the land before him, and the rather mundane image of the mesa, of the rock, becomes the image of the transcendent, of an unchanging God. A third example of the bishop's vision, of his ability to see the divine in the ordinary, occurs interestingly in Book 8, Gold Under Pike's Peak. Certainly there are scattered references here to the Pike's Peak gold rush and to Father Joseph's significant role in that particular historical moment. The gold in which we are really interested, however, is not that under Pike's Peak, but that under an isolated hill off the Albuquerque Trail. The hill is in an area where the rock is a curious shade of green, and even the earth has the same green tint. Underneath the green, though, is a rock of gold, a strong golden ochre, very much like the gold of the sunlight that was now beating upon it. This rock, hidden beneath the green, will become the Cathedral of Santa Fe. In other words, under the thin surface of the material, Latour finds that which will house the very presence of God. Unlike the gold under Pike's Peak, the gold of wealth, this is the gold of beauty, which in the vision of Latour is very close to the divine. As he studies the piece of rock in his hand, he displays a special way of handling objects that were sacred, the same manner he extends to things which he considered beautiful. While these examples point toward Bishop Latour's tendency to see the ordinary, even the divine, in surroundings that are ordinary, we should not think that the priest's refined vision is a projection of piety onto his surroundings. If this were the case, we should immediately question the reality of what he is seeing. Is he simply trying to force a spiritual meaning or relation onto a physical reality which doesn't already contain it implicitly? Firstly, the book seems to expel this notion in the way that its own perspective blends with Latour's. Sometimes it specifically details a vision that the bishop has, but other times it goes into long descriptive passages that leave the reader thinking it Latour's vision. The language reveals a certain sensitivity to the shape of things, quite like his.
Vision, the physical process of it, must necessarily have an object, and so a thinking man concludes that the order he finds is the order put there by the outside mind, God. A man who does not see everything may conclude that God, therefore, is a violent God, if the order he sees is one of violence. Or God may be madly gluttonous for pleasure, or sadistic, or arbitrary, or both the creator and servant of death. But a man who concludes one of these is not a man whose vision is complete. He has missed the marvelous and impossible proportionality of the world, the order in mind's obvious love of variety and color, the riot of unnecessary gorgeous material, the extravagance of things which are alive. And he has missed kind things, breathing things, things loving and being loved. A man who sees everything that is, and takes evil negations of existence for what they truly are, will conclude that the order to be seen is one of beauty, and conclude the resultant characteristics about God. This is the quality of Latour's vision. His pointing out and naming affirms an order of beauty, one which he did not create, but which does have a new substance in his hands. What he sees is beautiful, simply put. Father Latour, who is sensitive to the shape of things, distinguishes minute variations of color, names visual associations, and doesn't allow mountains to be left dusty and forgotten as the barest iconic image he would need to understand them. Instead, his mountains are wave-like mountains, resembling billows beaten up from a flat sea by a heavy gale, and their green was of two colors, aspen and evergreen, not intermingled, but lying in solid areas of light and dark. Even his encounters with historic symbols of evil and darkness find themselves touched with light and purity. Though the goat had always been the symbol of pagan lewdness, Latour told himself that their fleece had warmed many a good Christian, and their rich milk nourished sickly children. Latour welcomes sensory input, recognizing that his impressions are the result of an object impressing itself upon his consciousness, and a God who put that object there, and as such designed it. A thing designed reflects the designer, says something about the mind and hands that formed it. Latour's affirmation of sound, of color, of note, of form, of placement and refinement is therefore his affirmation, or his worship, of a personal God who speaks, reveals himself to human eyes, articulates with tone and variance, has shape, and defined both space and particular delicacy. Latour goes where this God wills. It is always back to him.